I know that probably most of you are familiar with our mission, which is to empower every person and organization in the planet to achieve more, which is a very broad, ambitious mission. But we also know that it's almost an impossible mission to achieve if we just leave it to the market, to the market forces to make it happen. You know, when we have half of the population in the planet with no access to any technology whatsoever, not even feature phones, it's very hard to imagine a world that is changing rapidly, that is becoming increasingly digital, and that it's changing everything, the way in which we interact, the market dynamics, the way in which governments operate, where half of the population of the planet are basically living in another industrial age. It's hard, right? So when I think about the panel in today's event organized by Global Washington, it's quite a challenge, you know, because when you think about demographic, well, different groups that live in a state of fragility, this gap even becomes more exacerbated. You know, we in Microsoft have been working for over a decade in trying to bridge at least the digital divide, and we know that just bringing technology isn't enough. That ultimately technology is just a tool to help enable the various initiatives and organizations and governments that are trying to address some of the world's most pressing issues. I think that's what you're going to be talking about today, and I just wanted to welcome you all and hope that you have a very productive session. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Let's see, is this working? Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Leo.
There it is.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you for setting the stage for our conversation today, and thank you all for coming today. I'm Kristen Daly. I'm the Executive Director of Global Washington, which is a network of 165 for-profits and nonprofit organizations that have a presence here in Washington State and do work to improve lives in developing countries. Microsoft is one of our founding members. Akhtar Badshah actually used to be at Microsoft Philanthropies, and he started that partnership, and he's now chair of my board. I also wanted to thank Cameron and others at Microsoft that helped make this event possible, and hope for hosting us today. So one of the things we at Global Washington are very proud of is we just celebrated our 10-year anniversary. And at our conference just this past month, one of the things we did was launch a new initiative around the Sustainable Development Goals. We've decided that as a state, as Washington State, we can catalyze the world to help advance the Sustainable Development Goals. We have the actors here, both in the private sector and the nonprofit sector, our academic institutions and foundations here. So Global Washington is embarking on this new initiative. And one of the goals of this initiative is to really break down silos within the global development field and look at the targets underneath the SDGs, because no one intervention is going to be sufficient. So I'm very excited about this topic today, because when you think about fragile states or fragility around the world, there has to be a comprehensive solution. And there's actually unintended consequences sometimes with one intervention. So breaking down the silos and looking at a solution, whether it be with global health and climate change and good governance, is something that Global Washington really is taking on as an objective. So I'm glad that we're looking at this topic. It's a great way to launch our initiative and looking at what we call the wicked problems that are addressed in global development. And we're very fortunate to have 3 experts with us today, actually all representing different sectors, because not only do we need to break down issue areas, we have to bring the power of foundations, private sector, and nonprofits to these solutions. And I'm just going to set the context a little bit, because when we talk about fragile states, it's kind of a wonky global development term. And I want to just say that what it means is when there are the ability of a region in the world where the government and civil society cannot mitigate risk. And this makes the population there much more vulnerable to economic and political crises and natural disasters within their community. And our panelists are the experts and they'll weigh in on it. So, and recently the OECD came out with a report that Rebecca Wolfe is actually a contributor, and really said the old term of fragile states is not even accurate, because this isn't about national borders in a country and saying that just Syria is fragile, and really looking at fragility in a broader sense, and looking at regions of the world that cross national boundaries and thinking about the state of the population around the world. So we're going to talk about fragility in that context today. So I'm just going to briefly introduce our speakers. You have their bios in front of you, and then we will jump into the conversation. First, we have Cameron Birge in the middle here, and Cameron is a senior program manager here at Microsoft Philanthropies. He's been here for 2 years. And prior to Microsoft, he worked at 10 years for the World Food Program through the UN system, primarily in South Sudan. So he has both present and past experience for this topic today. And prior to World Food Program, he was 5 years in the military. Here at Microsoft, he leads the team in humanitarian emergency work and AI for humanitarian action. So Cameron, thanks for being here today. Next, we have Rebecca Wolfe on the end here, who's a director at Mercy Corps, and she's also a leading expert around the world in political violence. Her expertise both in behavioral science is really relevant to looking at refugees as they're experiencing violence around the world. And she is one of the experts in looking at violence prevention in regions of the world such as Nigeria, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Indonesia, and Guatemala. Last we have John Norris, who's a deputy director at the Gates Foundation, where he focuses on policy and strategy and global trends. He also has an extensive background working for the US government and the United Nations and other policy institutions. He was part of President Obama's Global Development Council and field disaster expert at USAID. So, incredible expertise on this panel. One thing I want to talk about too is when you think about fragility, fragile places in the world, you might think of Yemen or Syria or this morning Venezuela or regions in Central America. So we're going to start and kick off our conversations by asking our panelists, what are the common misconceptions around fragility in these regions of the world? So John, I'm going to ask you to start.
Thanks, it's a pleasure to be here this morning. There's an awful lot of misperception about how we think about fragility, and even among people that do development professionally. I know, not to name check my own institution, but as I work the halls of the Gates Foundation, there's lots of people who do fantastic work in development that fall prey to some pretty easy misconceptions about fragility. You know, the first one is where our mind goes the second somebody says fragility. I'm guilty of it. I imagine our other panelists are guilty of it. Your mind immediately goes to South Sudan. It goes to Somalia. It goes to Syria. It goes to the worst cases. When you think of fragility, you hear the phrase, you begin to think of the first 5 minutes of Saving Private Ryan. It's instinctive, it's natural, I totally get it. The cohort of fragile states is much larger. It includes lots of places where there isn't a deadly conflict going on right now. You've got a place like Haiti. Nobody's died in anything resembling a battlefield conflict in Haiti in the last decade. It's certainly a fragile state. There's a bunch of countries that are trying to emerge from conflicts 5 or 10 years ago, a bunch of places that have underlying ethnic tensions, places that you wouldn't necessarily think of, but are very prone to that kind of risk and could slide backwards into deadly conflict because their reserve of coping mechanisms is pretty shallow. You know, so I think that's the first one. The second one is we tend to think of fragility as a poor problem, that this is something that happens in really poor places. Over half the countries on the fragile states list right now are middle-income countries. Syria had fantastic shopping malls before the conflict, literally. You can go online and Google images from 8 or 9 years ago of a mall that, you know, would look totally at place in an Iowa suburb. And so it wasn't just a lack of money, it wasn't just a lack of economic growth that was driving fragility. It's these larger social fissures. We need to appreciate that just doing better on the economic scale doesn't get you out of fragility, doesn't get you out of this conflict. You know, and I think the third one, which I think very much links back to the first notion, that it's kind of this very dystopian moment, is I think there's a lot of tendency for people to think of fragility and conflict as some perpetual state, some almost preordained state of command. If you talk about fragility, people talk about the Middle East conflict. They'll talk about ethnic tensions that have dated 1,000 years. You know, I could point to 2 countries that have had periodic wars over the last 2,000 years, every 30, 40 years over that period. And you could easily say that this is, you know, they're bound to fight. They're just 2 countries that don't get along and we shouldn't try to intervene. You would be talking about France and Germany. Are France and Germany fated to perpetual conflict? Is this some form of manifest destiny? I would argue no. And I would say there's very few conflicts and cases of fragility that we've seen that are perpetual. You know, I spent a chunk of my early career working in the Balkans during the conflict in that country. I took my wife and 3 kids last summer to Croatia for vacation. The biggest concern seemed to be the influx of cruise ships, which was a very different problem set than 15 years before. Liberia, you know, 10 or 15 years ago was about as bad and hopeless and neglected a place as you could find. It's made enormous progress. These are places and situations that with smart decisions and a will and a lot of hard work can really change pretty quickly. And I think those are all common points to think about as we broach our topic today.
Cameron, do you want to add to what you think some misconceptions are?
I don't know how to follow that. Actually, I'll probably speak to also to more of my personal experience than actually my Microsoft side. To speak to Microsoft, we make tools. We do. We're not the implementers. We're there to support those who are. We see resilience as, especially digital resilience, as something very critical for things like state institutions. Institutions and bureaucracies, I don't know if you give them enough credit, if you've grown up in them, but they are powerful, amazing things when done correctly, and especially if they're trusted. And if you don't have that trust in those systems, then you end up with that risk. And this is middle income or even high income countries. And you can see what's going on now in our nation and in Europe. And so we do seek to provide the tools and resources those who are trying to build those institutions better, more transparent, and more supportive of the social structure in need. On a personal experience, I would say a common misconception that I've often dealt with, and again, my lenses are very narrow. So my lenses have been from the conflict areas of East Africa and a little bit of some of the disaster response globally. But it's also not to forget that whatever situation you're in, somebody is winning. Somebody is doing okay in that situation, and they very much would like that to stay the same way. They want to ensure that they're still winning, which does make it challenging for organizations like Mercy Corps and Gates when they're getting involved on how do you initiate a change whereby you want to make things better for a group as a whole, and there is that challenge there.
Thank you. I think also that was probably the first compliment I've heard of bureaucratic systems. Cheering for that, that's good.
Background, by the way, for me, I'm an operations and logistics guy. I love systems.
You don't love them until they're gone.
Yeah, that's true. Great, Rebecca.
So to build on both those points, and I'll say John took some of my points directly, and we actually did not talk beforehand, but I'll build on some of those, is the case of Syria. I think it shows that misconception that fragile places aren't always poor. A lot of my research has been on this misconception that young people without jobs would join violent movements, and we saw a lot of proof that that was not the case. a lot of unemployed people do not join violent movements. The same way a lot of poor countries don't fall into conflict. And so at the same time, more wealthy countries do fall into conflict. And I think our ability to predict Syria has made us question our ability to predict which countries are going to fall into conflict. And it has raised some important questions around governance and inclusion as one of those major issues around fragility, more so than it did, I think, pre-Syria. I think another important misconception is, again, in my work has been a lot around violent extremism, and people think that violent extremism causes fragility. It's actually the other way around. It's in fragile states that violent extremist groups emerge, and it's often in already existing conflicts. And so they take that weak institutions, again, why I do support bureaucratic systems and strong institutions is that they do keep places running and where people feel confident that there's someone out there to help them. And so once that's gone, once those norms are gone, that's when often violent extremist groups come in to provide or at least offer those services even if they can't provide it. And so being able to understand where those weak institutions are, where there's lack of inclusivity, those are probably where we should be looking at in terms of the next fragile places. Again, why Haiti is probably a much more fragile place than we would think because it doesn't have conflict yet. And I think that's another misconception, is that we think a fragile state is already in conflict. What we need to be better at is predicting when conflict is going to happen, because that's when things really start to fall apart. What we will see, again, in a really fragile place right now is DRC, with all that conflict. Technological solutions today aren't going to help the health problems in a DRC like Ebola. So we've seen huge advancements from Liberia and Sierra since the Ebola crisis there in terms of actually helping people. And now those technological solutions aren't worth very much if we actually don't have access to those populations. And so we have to think about that fragility in terms of those other downstream pieces. The last misconception I'll talk about is around migration. And so again, I think there's this large misconception that migrants and refugees make places fragile. So one, most of the evidence is migrants and refugees actually are an economic boom to places, not so much, not an economic problem. They actually are less likely to bring violence to an area, even though that's a huge misconception. What's the problem is often government responses to that and what we're seeing as a polarization. And so my big fear in this next potential risks around fragility is you're seeing some swing back to authoritarianism to handle some of these polarization issues. And we do, but that often comes with these points that I said earlier in terms of lack of inclusivity. And so I think we could see a huge cycle back towards more fragile states because there will be a blowback against the authoritarianism that's come out of the migration crisis. I'll end with that.
Thank you. So thinking about the misconceptions, these are regions in the world not always violent, not always in conflict. This is very complex. If you think about all of the characteristics you all just talked about, and that it's not just national governments, there's localized regions. What are the solutions? What are the ways that that your organization is making a difference to cause more, to inspire and put a region on the path to resiliency rather than headed down, if they're a fragile region, into violence or other things? John, let's start with you. If you can talk a little bit about the Gates Foundation and their approach to this. This is something I think most of us don't know in terms of how the Gates Foundation sees this. So if you could talk a little bit.
Sure. And I think the foundation, where I'm fairly new, is an interesting example that there's lots of people in development. I think probably Bill and Melinda, as they were starting out, that want to steer clear of fragility or things that they think would drive conflict because they think it's too political. And there is a sense that we just want to do development. We want to improve living standards. We want to make life better for people in the developing world. We don't want to muck around in all this political, social, dynamic issues. But the real fact is, all development is political, whether you like it or not, and whether you really appreciate what's happening or not. There's a great case study from Nepal where there had been a massive AID education effort in the 60s and 70s. 20 years later, it was almost a perfect map of where the Maoist insurgency emerged. And people say, well, was it because the education program was a failure? Was it because it raised expectations and people realized that they were getting screwed by landlords and upper caste government officials and that they weren't benefiting? Did it raise expectations that weren't able to be met with jobs? So I think there's lots of ways that you can take on these issues. I think the foundation has approached them more from a softer side, trying to appreciate that there are real things that you can do that you stay out of politics but can really take some of the steam out of the kettle. A good example for me is an idea of land tenure. You've got lots of countries around the globe where women don't have the right to hold or inherit property. There are lots of groups, because they lack a legal identity, can't inherit land, they can't open a bank account, they can't vote. You can take on some of those issues that go to financial services for the poor, that go to legal identity, that go to land tenure, that don't feel like you're wading into politics, but can really have an important transformative effect on society in making it less unfair. And when you are sitting far away from a place and looking at all the things that could drive fragility and all the different numbers and drivers and statistics across the country, it can feel really complicated. When you're on the ground in a place, it becomes really self-evident more often than not. Are there people in the society who will be denied fundamental rights because they grew up on the wrong side of a river, because they speak the wrong language, because they're the wrong gender? Are there people that don't have economic opportunity because of they are? Do government benefits flow disproportionately to the president or prime minister's tribe, family, home village? All of these things will stand out in really bright, harsh ways. Do you have to pay a bribe every time you get in a taxi to go through a checkpoint? These are the irritants that are under, if they get under your skin as a visitor or an aid worker, think of what they're like to live with in a day-to-day.
Thanks. Rebecca, I'm going to go to you next, because one of the things I noticed in this OECD report where Rebecca contributed, she stated on behalf of Mercy Corps, the world is experiencing a 25-year peak in violence. And this violence right now is actually reversing some of the hard-fought development gains that we've made, and especially in these fragile places. So given that challenge, what can an organization like Mercy Corps do?
So I think we have seen, after a long period of time where violence was decreasing, we're starting to see, we saw it come up again. It's starting to go down a little bit, but what we've also seen is when I first got into this field, most humanitarian funding was going towards people who would suffer because of natural disasters. It's now going to people suffering from conflict. It's basically a flip from 80-20 to natural disasters to conflict to 20-80. And so I think what we're seeing is also with conflict, the humanitarian assistance has to go much longer because it's not an immediate crisis that then you can actually have a response and focus on it. Conflict goes for years and it moves to location. So in Syria, we've seen how it's gone from different areas of the country. And so where your response is changes. With that, I think what is unusual about Mercy Corps and is the fact that we work at an interesting intersection between humanitarian work, development work, and peace building work. I think there are a lot of organizations that do humanitarian work and development work and bring them together. And there's a lot of peace building organizations out there as well, but I think there are a few organizations that actually work at that intersection of all three. And because Mercy Corps sees that as our mission, we actually focus on those states, on those countries that are going, or either in conflict or often transitioning out. And so with that, what I think I've seen really change is how to think about both short-term and long-term programming. So you can work and move places out of the most dire places to something more productive like a Liberia. And so, and this is, you need to do short-term programming. You need to stabilize people's lives so that they can absorb any of the other type of assistance that is being given. And so, for example, if someone doesn't have food, one, they're not going to be able to even pay attention in a training, for example. And we forget about that. If people don't have cash and worried about an income, they aren't going to be able to focus on other things because their mind is busy elsewhere. And I think we actually don't think about that enough. But if you only focused on that short term, you're not addressing those longer term issues that are causing the problem. And so what I've seen us do more of in the field general is how do you pair these things to deal with the short term and the long term together. I think we often did things sequentially before, and the problem is you actually then aren't dealing with the longer term issues. You're waiting too long to start those longer term issues. So for example, when I was on, I directed our peace building team for a while, and we really started to think about how could we address conflict at the start of a humanitarian crisis rather than after the humanitarian crisis was over. And there was a big push, in part led by Mercy Corps and the coalition in CAR, in Central African Republic, to actually do peace building work as we were doing humanitarian work. It was the first place I've seen that done, and unfortunately I'm not seeing that model happen elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very unique. It sounds like you've really looked at the complexity of the issue and tried to have a comprehensive solution that's very complex in and of itself. Before I go to Cameron, do you have maybe a specific program that you could talk about in a region of the world, just to give a little more example for this?
So one place where I've seen it, I'll talk more about the CAR, the Central African Republic work. And so that was a Muslim-Christian conflict there. And what we saw was in places where we were doing food distributions and so forth, we also brought Muslim and Christian leaders together. And we had projects to help both communities. So people, in a sense, did community service for both the Muslim and Christian communities together, building those relationships across those lines. And so when conflict did break out elsewhere in neighbor communities, a couple years later, actually violence did not occur in the places where we were working. And so that allowed, and so you don't lose those gains that happen because violence breaks out elsewhere. We're seeing the same actually in the middle belt of Nigeria now, where there's a big fear around election violence in the upcoming election. We did a peace building program very similar where we brought leaders from the farmers and pastoralists together. And there was an outbreak of violence about a year ago, and in the communities where we were working, relationships were maintained compared to the places where we weren't working.
Great. Okay, Cameron, can you put back on your Microsoft hat and think about just in general, tech companies do a lot in terms of donations, of supporting not NGOs, but what else can tech companies, what's the role of tech companies in these regions of the world?
Yeah, so actually when I first saw that question, I started wrapping my head and I was like, how am I going to answer this? And then I remembered other people already have. So I would like to give two quotes actually from Satya, our CEO, on basically answering why. Why actually is there a role for private sector, especially tech companies in this space? I have two quotes here. That practically, we as Microsoft have a moral obligation to continue to innovate, to build technology to solve big problems, and to be a force for good in the world, as well as a tool for economic growth. It's important to be dedicated to creating great products, serving customers, and earning profits for our investors, but that's not sufficient. We also need to think about the impact of our actions in the world and its citizens long into the future. I mean, it goes beyond to actually follow our mission, which is empowering every person. It is going beyond just being a profit-making company. And that still is an important goal. We are a private sector company and we do have that obligation to our shareholders, but it can't be at all expense. There is that there's that responsibility that must be maintained. There's investments that need to take place that are not going to be profit driven. And there's some examples there I'd like to cite, and some recent ones that are kind of exciting. I can speak to Philanthropies all day long, but there are some other projects which sort of outline as well. So for example, we have what's called the Defending Democracy team, and they're relatively new. And so this is how to provide tools to people running for office or in office to help help them be safer online. Unfortunately, IT awareness is not high in a lot of government officials. So how do we step in and provide that assistance for free and that support? And we have to be careful there. We can't do it in every country. There are definitely policy rules about donating to political parties, to politicians. So it's a very carefully area navigated. But we should do that. We have a responsibility to do that. I don't know if you saw the news yesterday, but there was a recent tool for the Edge browser that was launched with NewsGuard. NewsGuard is basically a website verification, news verification platform, and you're either a green or a red. And so let people who land on a website know the information you're reading is considered relatively valid or high risk. It's caused a huge uproar already, and a lot of good discussions need to happen. There are organizations which said, hey, we need to fix ourselves, we're going green. And there's organizations out there who said, we do not deserve to be a red, even though we won't tell you who actually owns us. So it's creating those discussions in the space, which was the goal. The use of technology to help highlight that. Like, how can you be sure what you're seeing? And then in the areas that we're really trying to push boundaries, we have a deep investment now going on in the identity space. We as Microsoft do view a decentralized identity that is user-controlled and managed as the appropriate path forward. There are a number of disagreements in that, which is fine, it's a great discussion to have, but we are putting an investment in there to create these tools for people to have access into services, to exist, to empower themselves. And so there is a lot of work going on that. And then when then going to our philanthropy side, Microsoft is going to do what they're good at in locations that we can have an impact. In not every area of the world can we say the same. And we rely heavily on our partner network. Organizations such as Mercy Corps, Gates, I mean, the people who are actually experts in these regions and the programming, to provide them with tools and resources to help them do their job better and more efficiently. We're not going to drive the programs. We're not going to sit there and be direct with a beneficiary and have the outcome and drive that. But we want the organizations who do to do it better. And that's sort of where our strengths lie, and that's how we're approaching it.
That's great, thanks. And your work around identity goes back to what John was saying around even issues like land rights. I mean, identity to achieve land rights is instrumental. So we've kind of set the context of the problem, talked about some of the solutions. So how are you all feeling about the future? Are the problems going to outweigh the solutions? Is there optimism as we go forward? Sitting watching the news, for me, I'm not feeling very optimistic about global trends right now. So, and you all are deep into these issues much more than the average person. So tell us some good news if you can, or to tell us, are you optimistic about the future? John, I'll start with you.
Yeah, that's a slightly complicated question. It is shaded by the proximity to the daily headlines. And we have had a spike in violence the last couple of years. But we are also living in what is the most peaceful, prosperous period in human history by a whole lot. In those cases where we are seeing a spike in conflict, people killed on the battlefield, refugees, they're almost all cases where, for a variety of reasons, the international community has kind of turned its back, frankly. That we've kind of decided that Syria and Yemen and a handful of other places are too hard. And our track record is actually pretty good when the international community has kind of waded in and tried to sort out a peace process. And it's always ugly and it's never perfect and it takes a lot longer than anyone would like. But it usually puts some oil on the water and calms things down. Development indicators have leapt more in the last 50 years than the rest of human history combined. So there's lots of reasons to be optimistic. But I think some of those short-term trends particularly the behavior out of Washington, are causing lots of problems. The turning away from multilateral institution, the turning away from basic norms. This is a really good time to do bad things out there, I want to tell you right now. If any of you are looking to break a convention, break a treaty, be bad, not send thank you notes, this is the moment. Because everybody can point to Washington and other capitals and say, look, you know, we had Nigerian troops shooting on peaceful protesters and said, well, look, this is what President Trump tweeted out that he would do if people approached the Mexican border. And we're just following your example. So I think there are a lot of risks compounding in the short term, and I think a global economic slide would intensify a lot of those risks that drive fragility in places where the safety net isn't very well developed. But I think overall the broad arc is really, really encouraging. We just have to appreciate the benefits of cooperation and working together, and also realize the very high costs that we pay when we turn away from those practices.
That's good. So it sounds like there's potential optimism if we do
I'll take it.
some work on that. So thanks. Cameron, you want to go next?
I mean, I don't think the humanitarian community is going to be out of work anytime soon. That's the unfortunate situation that we live in. At the same time, yes, I mean, there's definitely, the conversations we're having with organizations are quite encouraging. There is a sense of awareness and a drive to do better and understand how to do better and to really get the metrics behind it, to be professional about it. A lot of the tools that you see sort of in advanced companies, how do you apply those now into the same sector and help that drive programming and ensure that you're actually measuring impact and outcomes? And I know that sounds kind of trite, we were all kind of been into the industry, but how to really get a sense of that. And we're having those conversations, and we're helping organizations with it, and those who do apply it, there's some amazingly powerful outcomes that take place. And so, not just those conversations, but also, I don't know if you guys have worked in the field, there can be a bit more of like, mine is mine, do not encroach on it, and then we are all going to bid for the same grants from this guy.
None of which happens in corporate settings.
Yeah, none of it happens in corporate settings, yeah.
Unfortunately.
But with the understanding is like, we know this needs to come together a bit more. We need to, there's enough need and work for everybody. How do we bring our systems together, but safely and securely? How do we talk about data exchanges and then work off that information? But it can't just be about, obviously, swapping Excel files and PII on them. How do you do so in a responsible manner that respects the privacy of the individuals you're trying to support? So having those conversations are quite optimistic, and we're excited about seeing where those go and working with the partners to get there.
Great. So having more data and people using it correctly is causing some optimism around the world.
Good data is key, by the way.
Good thing. Start. Good. Rebecca.
So a friend of mine often quips that in order to do this work, you have to be a professional optimist. But there are things that are, the trends are good. And so one of the things for me, and it's based on data, is we've done some really strong research on some development programs showing that they reduce support for violent groups. And they were very different programs. One was in Afghanistan, and it was a vocational training program that had a cash component. And another one was education with community service in Somalia. And basically, both programs showed a reduce of support for violent groups, but what the common factor in both of them is that it changed perception of local government, and that local government was being responsive to needs, and that inclusivity of the local government. And so, one, I can see that development assistance can be used to strengthen local government. I think for a long time, it was done in ways that undermine local governments, and we've seen an upward swing in that regard. And that is really important for fragile states, that government is seen as a partner for communities. Where, to build on John's comment, and this has been part of my frustration, what I've seen in the Middle Belt of Nigeria, is we have this great program, or we see these really great development investments, and yet leaders at a higher level are doing actions that counteract what we're doing at the more local level. And so, for example, the UN and the World Bank put out a report, I guess it's about a little over a year ago on pathways to peace. And most of it was focused on more of the development interventions and peace building and interventions at the local level, yet those actors should be able to compel leaders to act better. And this breakdown in these multilateral institutions to try to bring leaders to the table to create peace processes has been broken down. And unless we can fix that piece, all the good development work we do, it's gonna, in a sense, keep us treading water and prevent things from backsliding horribly, but we're never gonna get that upward swing until we can match those two more effectively.
That's great. So we as a global community are getting smarter about development work, the fundamentals, education, other things, but there's still that disconnect and work that's needed at the national governance level and others. So yeah, I would say reserved optimism from the panel, hopefully. But at this point, I want to open it up to questions from the audience. My colleague Donnie has a microphone. I ask that you state your name, your affiliation if you'd like, and try to direct your question to one of the panelists specifically.
Hi, my name's Lizzie. I work at Microsoft, but my background's foreign service. My question is actually to all of the panelists, but briefly, is how are you seeing climate change or extreme weather patterns changing what you're identifying as fragile states, or how that's playing into fragile states and maybe particularly violent extremism?
Rebecca, you want to start?
Sure. So climate change definitely is a factor in terms of fragile states. So we saw in the Horn of Africa a couple of years ago in terms of, so the climate change there has created a huge drought and famine-like conditions. What was interesting is Somalia, of the three countries, Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya, only Somalia actually reached famine-like conditions, because you had institutions in Kenya and Ethiopia that could better address it. And so that's where that climate weak institutions create fragility, is that in those places when there aren't those strong institutions, they can't handle the natural disaster. And then we're seeing, again, going to the middle belt of Nigeria, it is climate change that is bringing pastoralists further south, and they're in a sense called foreign pastoralists, who don't understand the norms that have been created for centuries between the farmers and pastoralists there. And so that's actually creating this uptick in violence in the middle belt. And our community programs weren't designed to handle, in a sense, outsiders coming in.
Yeah, I would just add, and I think Rebecca gets it exactly right, that there's some people write about climate change like it's going to be Soylent Green, or people are going to be just fighting over wells, and it's a very direct driver of conflict. I think more what we're seeing is it's another stress, and a pretty profound one in some places. And in places that are good at dealing with stress, they can sort it out. Traditionally, we don't have famines in democracies because there's a coping mechanism. We have serious drought, but people figure out a way to get food to the people who need it. So I think it is going to be more of a problem, particularly at a time when we're seeing lots of other stresses on a bunch of countries.
I mean, not much more to add. I mean, on the Microsoft side, it's definitely an area that we believe is important in addressing, and the AI for Earth program, under the AI for Good pillar, is supporting programs and the use of technology on helping communities address the impact and effects of climate change. I mean, personal anecdotes, I've been managing sudden onset disasters for Microsoft now for almost 3 years. I mean, you can't, causation's not correlation, and we all agree, but I think we get the sense for those of us who have been doing the responses that each year is progressively more and more, I mean, things are just larger. I mean, everything from, even from when I first started to what we're doing now, every event just seems to be larger and more impactful, and we end up really straining through resourcing, which we didn't see first started.
You mean the natural disasters anymore?
Natural disasters. Again, that would be difficult to actually put those two together, but it's the sense I think we're feeling.
Hi, my name is Melissa Neer. I'm Executive Director of Architects Without Borders, and I have a question specifically for Rebecca or John, whichever of you is excited to weigh in. So we are a volunteer-based organization that helps support many programs in fragile states through design. And one of the issues that we butt up against regularly is how to evaluate potential projects that are being put forth by faith-based organizations. So I'm just wondering, through the fragility lens, when there is an absence of institutions and religious organizations fill those voids around education and basic health needs, how would you recommend, what questions would you ask to evaluate the value of the programs? And are there resources that you can point me to that are organizations that are answering these questions in partnership?
Yeah, I think one of the really important things in looking at programs like that is, who benefits? And is the caseload of beneficiaries, is it spread across genders equally? Is it spread across different groups? Is it, if it's a religious affiliated organization, is it only people of that religion that the program will flow to? Is there a conscious design effort to make sure that the benefits of the program flow much more equitably across society or different parts? And there's some really smart design things that our Mercy Corps colleagues and others can speak to, of using the delivery of programs to actually kind of reward good communal behavior. I remember a program in Bosnia as they were rebuilding villages. They were providing construction assistance, but only to communities that had committed to allow refugee and IDP return. And that was a good, clear barometer. Is this one town committed to actually a multi-ethnic future or not? So I think once you start asking those kind of harder questions, not just how many people are we going to feed, how many immunizations are we going to deliver, but what's the caseload look like? I think you start to get to some much more interesting questions, because I guarantee you they are thinking about it, and it's conscious in their head, even if it's not.
Just to add briefly, so that inclusivity, are they just benefiting people in their religious group versus others, I think is probably your number one thing to really think about. I imagine if there is religious-based conflict in these places, there are probably groups from both sides. And can you find a way to encourage partnership between religious groups in the implementation of the program to be, in essence, a role model for those communities? And Mercy Corps had done that as even years ago in Indonesia, but we continue to do that today in Nigeria. We just finished data collection on a study in the northeast of Nigeria where we had religious leaders on both Christian and Muslim sides talk about religious tenets, so common tenets, so to change, to see if they could influence behavior of accepting former members of Boko Haram back in the community. And we found religious leaders were really successful in doing that. And so that would be really important. In terms of a resource, the Alliance for Peace Building just put out a toolkit around religion and peace building, and so that might be helpful for you to look at.
Right, that's a good question. Sometimes the faith leaders are the best partners in terms of sustainability as well, because they're pillars in the community that can make sure it's implemented. Other questions?
Hi, my name is Brendan, and I'm former U.S. government as well, and also I've worked for CGIAR, which received funding from the Gates Foundation. And I guess John really, CGIAR is it's an international agricultural research nonprofit with 15 centers. It's sort of focused on food for a food secure future for humanity. Anyway, so John really started this off, but everyone else chimed in with sort of lots of agreement on this issue, which is this belief in systems and structures and governance and issues like that. and sort of, oh, the UN and the international system of sovereign states, perhaps is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And yet, I feel like there's this counterfactual that, frequently we point on a place of fragility on a map and say, sorry to throw the British under the bus, but boy, the British 150 years ago, 200 years ago, drew lines here that might be the source of the conflicts that we're seeing. And sort of the system doesn't really align with the reality. So how do you sort of hold those two tensions, in your practice, in your work?
Yeah, and certainly not to conviction in the utility of the international system is, I don't embrace it from any sense of being ahistorical. And lots of mistakes are made. And, that peace is often something that the international community does when it can get around to it, when it feels it has the bandwidth to do it. That it's still often treated as a luxury, particularly in big parts of Africa and Asia, that it's seen as, yes, we'll take that on if we don't have an economic crisis at home, or if our popularity numbers are sufficiently high. And I think that maybe one of the things that can be a little Pandora's boxy about what can come out of this period where there's been a lot of turbulence and a lot of bad faith actions in terms of the international system is maybe a fairer, better international system emerges from that. It took World War II and its aftermath to put in place the current structure of the international system that had been a moment of real disaster globally. So I think in some ways the international system has to continue to evolve. Lots of horrible decisions, unfair decisions have been made, are being made. But within that, it is the best system we have.
I would just, that's a fine thing,
Hi, first of all, Akhtar Bacha. I teach at the University of Washington. Thank you very much. I mean, it was very, very interesting to look at how we think about fragile states. I just want to kind of see how you would expand that conversation to include fragile communities. Because not every state is fragile, but almost every state has fragile communities. And sometimes intervening in a fragile community may be much easier to do and may actually stop a state from descending into a state of fragility. So just some anecdotes or examples that you may have.
I think Central America is probably a really good example of that. And so, for example, I spent a lot of time in Guatemala City designing our violence prevention program there because it was recognized that there are huge advancements in Central America in terms of economic gains. You've seen that, and in terms of democracy. But yet there are these pockets that threaten destabilization, clearly not just of those countries, but the region. And so we've done a lot to try to build, in a sense, social cohesion, building relationships with government in those communities, recognizing these communities feel left behind. And again, where violent groups, so violent extremist groups and gangs actually act somewhat differently, somewhat the same in terms of targeting areas that are less cohesive, where government isn't present. And so how do you up that government presence? There's some actually really good research and work with the police in Medellin in Colombia of doing more of that community policing so people know that the government is there and willing to help them. What was interesting is how do we've seen improved service provision in some of these places, getting perceptions from communities to match the improvement in service provision has been difficult. And so that's how bringing the community more aware of those improvements is probably that next stage.
There's also been a big push within kind of the community that does fragility to look at the subnational level, to begin applying those analytics at a province level, at a city level, including here in the United States. I saw a ranking of kind of the most peaceful or less fragile cities and most stable in the United States. Baltimore, Detroit, places where inequality was really a super severe issue. Not surprisingly, really ranked high on the fragility list for U.S. cities. Syracuse, New York, I grew up just down the road from Syracuse, New York, showed up as one of the 3 least fragile cities in the United States, which kind of surprised me actually a little bit, that it's a bit of a Rust Belt area in terms of the economy. But I also thought it is going to be 28 below this weekend in Syracuse, which nobody's going outside. But I think people are really appreciating that, taking that kind of municipal level approach is really right. In places where you've got bigger and bigger cities, a lot of the rural poor have emigrated into the cities for a variety of different reasons. And it can take just one really bad weekend or series of events in a metropolis to really catch a whole country in the throes of violence and other political divides. So it's a very good question. I think the field is moving that way. It still has a really long ways to go.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Amy Vander Zanden, and I'm a global health researcher and a Mercy Corps alum. So this question's for everyone, but Rebecca, you mentioned in your closing remarks that you felt the sort of grassroots and community level work that you were doing was sometimes in conflict with messaging and work happening at the government level. And I'm interested in hearing how all of you think your organizations, what role you think your organizations play in affecting what's happening at those higher levels of systems.
So I think one piece at Mercy Corps that we really tried to invest in over the last couple of years is recognizing that a development program alone isn't scalable, but influencing policy, that's where we would reach scale. And so that's why Mercy Corps invests in research and learning, so we develop that evidence base for that policy change. And this, I saw this firsthand actually years and years ago when I was at Partners in Health. I was there when we were working on multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, and there was a WHO policy not to treat the poor with MDR-TB, and we showed we could, by having really good data, we could show that you could treat the poor with MDR-TB, and therefore, and it wasn't such a linear line, but we were able to change WHO policy. And I think Mercy Corps sees the same thing with some of these more social issues. If we're able to show evidence such that we can reduce violence and so forth, we can have better policies. And we've seen that around the violent extremism debate. You don't see single sector employment programs to reduce violent extremism the way I saw 10 years ago.
I think on Microsoft's side, it's interesting on how the leadership have actually stepped up and used their voice in those policies that, again, Microsoft's going to get involved in policies where they have an interest and they believe they can make an impact. I mean, everything from locally, for Washington State education, and guiding that. Microsoft does a lot with the state government to try to influence it and affect change. And actually, it gives something simple. So we are big supporters in computer education, STEM education in high schools. Okay, and again, this is necessarily directly tied to fragility, but it's about ensuring that the right education to the right groups so that they have a clear path. Well, when they first started, I'm making I can't remember the number, but basically only a handful of states actually, 11? There we go, thanks Andrew. 11 states treated computer but like 11 states actually allowed for computer science classes to be one of your math or science credits in a high school curriculum. But now, through policy influence and change, they're up to 23, I think they're up to 33 now? I'm gonna give the mic to this guy. Go with it. And then also, I mean, on the other side too, is Brad Smith put the legal weight of Microsoft behind fighting a lot of the immigrant bans that are taking place in the US and not being afraid to step into the courtroom when it makes sense to do so. So there is a role for the voice of companies, this isn't just a tech center, of companies in these environments.
Yeah, I think you raise a really important point, and I think by and large, everybody's pretty lousy at it. You know, I think that there's, you've got a bunch of different bilateral donors, you've got AID, you've got DFID, you've got the Swedes, the Norwegians, you've got the bank, you've got the IMF, you've got private philanthropy. All are really focused on the program level of what they're trying to achieve in a very specific sector. More often than not, there's a real inability of all those different actors that are trying to do the right thing in a place to sit down and do serious analysis of the political economy of that place and push for broader reforms that will make the society more cohesive. Not to make all aid conditional, but to say, look, we will reward success. If you can do some of these things, we'll put more money in. And if it looks like you're lacking a basic commitment to invest in your own people, to embrace reform, to make good policy choices, you know, it's a competitive world. We'll put our money into other places. We're not going to take money away or food away from a starving person. We'll continue humanitarian aid programs. But a lot of the stuff we're doing, absent government prioritization, isn't probably going to be very effective. And that's really hard for the donor community to get its head around. And as a result, these fragile states that don't have very high government capacity have to deal with a whole series of different donors with different grant demands and different paperwork and timesheets and different ministers and parliamentarians who come through town. So more often than not, we end up getting a sum that is not necessarily greater than its parts.
Isn't that the premise of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, of rewarding good behavior and tying aid to that? Do you have a comment on the MCC?
It is, but you know, the AID and others would say that MCC gets to just pick the well-adjusted kids that work with them. You know, that it's a self-selecting pool, that yes, okay, we're just going to work in a set of countries that have already or are nearly passing a series of fairly rigorous benchmarks. That's good. I think the MCC is well designed. I think it's an important piece of work. But even the MCC is really realizing right now that they're going to increasingly have to look at fragile states because their pool of well-adjusted, kind of rapidly rising developing countries is drying up. And their structure and their system isn't particularly well adapted for having to make those smart decisions and look at a society and say, okay, you're going to build that bridge. Does it just connect one part of society to the capital, or is it going to, you know, are you going to build 2 bridges or 3 bridges? Who benefits? Who doesn't benefit? What are the social tensions underneath? The MCC doesn't have that kind of field presence to do that work that's really important in fragile contexts.
Other question?
Hi, my name is Patrick Culver. I work with MSF, or Doctors Without Borders. I have a question mostly about long-term planning in a humanitarian context with mobile populations and complex emergencies. Looking at situations, I was one of the people leading the logistical response in Benue in the Middle Belt in Nigeria about a year ago, and then talking to colleagues working in the Kibus or in Juba in South Sudan. We all seem to be stumped by the idea of how to have an exit strategy, as well as talk about long-term planning in a context that's constantly evolving in fragile contexts. So you all seem like smart people, I guess I'm wondering what your opinion is.
C might be the important word there. So Benue is exactly the conflict that affected our program there, where we were actually about to start our last round of data collection, and there was this huge round of displacement. And our local partner, I will say, was fantastic in terms of locating these displaced populations for that last round of data collection. But I think to your question around long-term planning, I think that's, and an exit strategy, I don't know if I have a good answer for you, because it's that, how do you leave that if the humanitarian problem continues? And so in the Middle Belt, and we're seeing it go up and down, where I think what was interesting back, say, 4 years ago, the Middle Belt was seeming to stabilize, and so particularly the UK government put all its resources into the Northeast where Boko Haram is. And now we're seeing actually more violence in the Middle Belt than we are in the Northeast, but we actually aren't seeing the money move as fast to the Middle Belt. And I see us often, as we're having stability gains, that a humanitarian crisis happens elsewhere in the country and everything moves there. The same thing happened in Iraq. So with that, we were seeing stability gains in areas of Iraq, and then ISIS hit and all our programming had to shift because that's where the money is. And so I guess I don't like this type of answer that I'm about to give, for us, it's how to help donors stick with a place a bit longer to see those gains through without losing attention. The problem is I recognize it's a resource problem as well, and so that's why I somehow hate to sort of just kind of pass the buck to the donors.
Yeah, I would add a point on it that this has been one of the real central challenges for development experts and the humanitarian community back at least 60 years. And I think there's always been a tendency to view security, politics, and development as three different endeavors. And they're not. They're really deeply intertwined in all the places that we collectively work. And they're deeply intertwined in the way you live your life in a developing country. They are not separate things. So we'll go into places and have tons of resources poured into security and weapons and a peacekeeping agreement with no political vision that would lift people up or convince people that their country is headed in the right direction. We think that perhaps providing better varieties of rice or small cash incentives will gain traction in a place where it's not safe for them to go out at night. And unless you begin to look at them as a whole, it's really hard to do that kind of long-term planning and get long-term traction. And part of it is that we have very separate communities. We have different tribes that do this work. The humanitarian community doesn't hang out with the development folks. Mercy Corps is a bit of an odd duck in that it kind of straddles both. I worked at AID. The culture between the development people and the humanitarian people, they're completely different. The humanitarian folks, they're kind of more fun in some ways. But, they're cowboys. They like to go in, they like to go out. They took risks. They had great parties. They used, they literally used body bags for ice bags at their Christmas party. Which isn't everybody's cup of tea, but very rarely does AID ever deploy the long-term development people and the humanitarian people together. They work under entirely different rules, different funding. If a humanitarian crisis hits, all the development people leave the country. Why don't you embed one or two that stay there and work with the humanitarian teams and could say, the ministry here has fantastic capacity. The humanitarians land on the ground. They may not know the country. They may not know the place. They'll pick up and leave when it's time for them to do so, when it's no longer a life-threatening situation. We're not making investments in a smart, integrated way. And I think until you bring those different strands together and are willing to talk about security and politics, when you're looking at relief and looking at long-term development, it's going to be hard to make transformative change.
Cameron, do you want to add anything about the division between humanitarian and development communities?
I have nothing really to add on to what's already been said. I had the same discussions at many late nights and have our own working theories, which are probably not appropriate for this conversation. Yeah, great parties. But no, there's nothing really more to add. It is an issue, and it's about, and in a lot of cases it does come down to resourcing as well. You want to, and you can see the answer, but trying to sit down and come up with the political support and the resources for it can be extremely challenging. Especially if the frustration can also be where it depends on how also the engagement is going on with the local community. If you're working with the local community, it's like, hey, this is our goal, please help us get there. It becomes quite a bit easier to talk about such integration programs. If you are kind of fighting in some ways, or you're sort of in conflict with what may be going on the ground, it becomes a lot more difficult to have that investment and have those conversations, that movement forward. So it also depends on the buy-in with those around.
Other questions? There's one over here.
Hello, my name is Tracy Patton, and I'm with an unrelated nonprofit, Committee for Children. I'm here just out of interest, but I heard you mention AI for good, Cameron, and I'm just curious, we've heard people like Elon Musk and Satya talk about some of the imminent threats of our future and a workless society or jobless society coming down the pipeline, and I just wonder what some of the other thoughts are in the nonprofit world about what that might mean for society and systems thinking and who's coming together with good ideas.
Cameron, you want to lay out a little bit more about it? A few minutes or half.
Sure, so AI for Good is an initiative that was announced by Microsoft, and it's the use of AI tools, AI and machine learning tools to help organizations have a better impact. And the three pillars, which are AI for Earth, AI for accessibility, and AI for humanitarian action. So I manage the last program, which is 4 focuses, which is disaster response, refugees and displaced persons, needs of children, and human rights. The goal is, in Microsoft view, is AI is just that, it is a tool. With my knowledge of what I've seen with the researchers, some of it's quite a bit further off than I think the media portrays it, I would like to say. Some of it is quite powerful, but they're all been built for helping somebody do their job better. The challenge is, though, is that yes, there is automation of what you consider quite manual processes, repetitive processes, which could be manual right now, which could be replaced by something like an AI tool, then that person still operates. I mean, when I'm working with organizations, the big thing is that we try to explain it's not magic fairy dust. No AI goes without a parent, just FYI. Because there are things that have to be maintained. They are a tool. They're going to make your job better, and in most cases not really replace your job. You still take your job to the next level. But the challenge has come in with skills requirements. So what skills do you need to actually be utilizing AI tools successfully in your job? And so we are also working investments in that space around. That's why we do believe digital skills from a goal standpoint are so crucial and important. And we have it from a philanthropic standpoint. It's actually our largest investment, and those teams are great. But
Yeah, I would add just a couple thoughts on it. Literally, I flew in last night from Geneva after attending a UN high-level panel on the future of digital cooperation and doing a bunch of these issues. I think there's a couple really important takeaways for the developing world on these issues. I don't buy the robots are going to eat all our jobs. Technology historically has been a net gain for jobs, but often in very disruptive ways. The microprocessor and computers decimated the typewriter industry. Looking around Redmond, it also created a couple other jobs in the process. We've seen it with accounting services, we've seen it with QuickBooks, we've seen it with the cotton gin and everything in between. The big thing that I think is really important in the developing world is what we're seeing is that technology can have really transformative effects. I think the Aadhaar, the ID, digital ID, and identity stuff in India is fascinating, playing out in a really sophisticated debate and sometimes legal debate about rights and how this information can be used. Obviously, we've got the example of mobile money in East Africa that has been absolutely transformative in connecting millions of people to financial services for the first time in history. But what we're seeing is there's pretty good take-up in places where governments are making smart decisions and smart investments in technology. And we're seeing just a roaring opening divide of inequality and lower usage rates in places where governments aren't making those kind of smart investments and smart architectural decisions. The challenges, particularly in fragile contexts, is you've got a bunch of governments with low capacity, and as you say, there's lots of government officials that don't know a lot about technology and are being asked to make these big, profound choices of kind of veering left or veering right. Do we invest in a national commitment to broadband? Is it about digital literacy? What are, and they're feeling somewhat overwhelmed. So I think one of the really urgent things is to try to figure out how you get that kind of capacity to governments that are already struggling to meet some of their basic needs at a time when these decisions are coming really fast and furious. Because as I said, in places that aren't able to take those smart decisions, we're really seeing the gulf widen even further, that those people who are connected to technology and have reasonable literacy are really making leaps forward, and other people are getting left much further behind. There was a great statistic in a WEF report on this out recently that by 2020, the average person in a lot of places will have 200 different online accounts and uses of their identity. And I think about it, I'm probably, and Netflix and the bank. Hey, it's not that far away for most of us right now. Then there's a bunch of people with zero. And what does that mean? That you can't get a loan, that you can't move money around, that you can't text message somebody, or there's a bunch of obstacles for social or cultural reasons that even if you have a phone, keep you from using anything.
Maybe one or two more questions.
So following up on that, my name's Catherine Endicott, and I work for PATH in the philanthropic area of our China. The thought that's been going through my head here is that we're in the middle of a revolution with AI and technology and digital, and it got started about 20 years ago. So I always think, if I read about the Industrial Revolution, what can I learn from that revolution that can help me just mentally survive this one with all the changes? And then I also believe that the United States is at the backside of their empire. And we don't know who's going to take our place, but someone will eventually, and it may not be in my lifetime. But what came to mind with this most recent question is China. So I lived in Cameroon from 1998 to 2000. China wasn't present. I talked to colleagues who are there now, and they're like, oh yeah, it's all over the place. So with China's investment in the African continent on development, maybe other places, I'm just curious to where are your thoughts as leaders of very large organizations that have a role to play, and I guess kind of back to the future, where do you see that in the world leader role and how that's impacting what's happening in the humanitarian or development or in the political?
Are you talking about the U.S. government world leader role, or?
Well, just the roles are potentially shifting, and if China were to become the next world leader, and you're seeing their role and investing in the continent of Africa. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think this goes to a point made earlier around norms and using development assistance in the past to also help create certain norms in countries. And China will not be able to have that type of influence. We're having less of that type of influence now around norms around democracy and institutions and inclusivity. And so I worry with China becoming more of a development partner in Africa and other parts of Asia. Sri Lanka is a perfect example. That there won't be that influence around those norms that we think have led to international cooperation to this point.
Yeah, the Chinese development efforts and kind of engagement in big chunks of African Asia right now, I think it's a more complicated picture than is usually painted. And you kind of have to look at the different forms of money that are flowing to get a richer picture underneath. The stuff that is offered as grants, the stuff that looks like ODA, Official Development Assistance out of Europe or North America, has a track record that is about as good as ODA. That it, the program efficiencies, the success rates, the what works, what doesn't, is about the same. And that's about probably 20 or 25% of Chinese money that's going into these places. The numbers are pretty opaque, so this is kind of guesswork, but reasonably advanced guesswork. The other stuff that's kind of more the infrastructure, Belt and Road stuff, the the lending to Sri Lankan port, East Africa railroads, looks an awful lot, and to prove that I'm not ahistorical, looks an awful lot like AID and the World Bank in 1963. You look at the huge smelting plant that was built in Ghana, in part to kind of sway in the Cold War, but was given with a 50-year concessionary rate to Alcoa, which I think they renewed at some point. Very little benefit flowed to Ghanaians. Alcoa has done fantastically well. The number of jobs created from it was relatively limited. And the other really important part was, it wasn't a great political boon for the United States to have some big clunky smelting plant that didn't really benefit Ghanaians. And I think the Chinese will probably begin to appreciate that having a bunch of countries run up some irresponsible debt or throw a lot of money behind irresponsible infrastructure projects, it's not only bad development, it's just bad foreign policy, it's just bad. It doesn't do you much good to reach agreements with autocratic governments when they're replaced. I think that there will be lots of folks in Zimbabwe that remember that Chinese got a bunch of concessional mineral rights after retiling Robert Mugabe's executive home with the fine Italian marble, literally. That probably doesn't stead Chinese standing in Zimbabwe very well over time. So in some ways, I think China is making a bunch of fairly rookie mistakes. And some of it is easy to write off and say that this is all kind of malintent or there's some insidious design. Some of it is just that they're new to these places, they're new to these environments, and they're making the exact same mistakes that other development agencies made as they started on.
I don't have anything to add to those.
This is great. I think we're at the end of our time, but I wanted to thank the panelists for taking this really complex issue and different regions of the world and really breaking it down for us. I'm really grateful that you all are working on this at such a system, institutional, government, and global frame of it. And that's to say also Global Washington has a number of nonprofits that work on some of these foundational programs such as building a clinic and building a school. And what I heard today is that those are ever so more important too in these fragile regions, and that larger organizations are working more at the systems level, and it all comes together. And all of this is really needed to really get at these wicked problems that we've been talking about. So help me thank the panelists.